Yeah, as Chris said, it's definitely the most exciting time during the life cycle of your application when you get to deploy and interact with Distillery and watch as things that you thought worked perfectly no longer work the way you thought. So if you're going to blame somebody, blame me. In any case, today what I'm here to talk about is trying to bring Elixir and releases closer together. And I'll get into releases a little bit, but first I wanted to ask, how many of you here have not deployed to a server of any kind in Elixir or used Distillery? Quite a few of you. Okay. That's still a ton of you that are using it apparently, but it's really great that you guys are here because it's a really exciting time to be doing deployment with Elixir, in my opinion, because things are about to change in a really good way. What I've been working on for the past several years is a couple of tools. First one called EXRM, and then another one called Distillery. That both do the same thing. They build Release, which is a collection of applications which are run as a single unit. It packages up all the dependencies for your application, the resources it uses, like anything under the priv directory, for example. Bundles that all together into a tarball, and then you can drop that on any server, whether it has Erlang or not, and run your application. In a way, it's a little bit more abstract than like a mixed project, in the sense that a mixed project is either a single application or an umbrella containing multiple applications. But either way, when you run a project, you're running everything. Releases allow you to break things up and deploy them in different configurations. So you might have an umbrella app that has a web API and an engine. You might want to deploy a bunch of engine nodes and maybe one or two web front ends. And releases allow you to break things up in your project that way and deploy them the way that you need to. Releases themselves are mostly packaging and management scripts. And of course, the resources and dependencies their application requires. But there's no source code necessarily. You can include it for reference or if you want to modify the code on the server, but it's not required. There's no build tools that are packaged into it. The idea is that much like a executable that you would build in Go or a jar file in Java, everything you need to run it is basically part of this package. So that also means that you could take a release that you built 2 years ago and deploy it on a server today, and it would work just fine. If you take, like NPM or Ruby or something like that, where you're fetching your dependencies every time and compiling each time you run the application, it's not ideal, right? Because things can shift under your feet and you don't really know what happened. This way, you build it in, you lock everything in the way you want it set up, and now you can reuse that release wherever you need to. The utility scripts are really there to enable some friendly UI over the release. It's not strictly necessary. The fundamental release tooling does not require it, but allows us to do some nifty things. So we can start a release in a couple different modes. One is foreground, that's equivalent to like mix run. Console mode, which would be like the interactive mode, like using IEX. And then a daemon mode where you can run it in the background, and it's effectively supervised as if you're running under something like systemd or supervisor-d, upstart. You can run it as a service in the background. Those things are part of the utility scripts of a basic release and are sort of the fundamental way you interact with it. They also enable the hot upgrades and downgrades. This is part of why releases are important. You can't really do upgrades and downgrades without it. You can do code reloading by swapping out a module, but it's not the same thing. And I'll get into maybe some detail around that later if I have some time. But the point is, releases and code upgrades are fundamentally part of the same umbrella. And then the remote shell is another key part of this. When you boot a release, you have a task there called remote console. It allows you to easily attach to that running application, poke around in the console, and experiment with what's going on at runtime if there's some problems. Allows you to do runtime tracing, execute some code to poke around at processes and things running. It's a really great way to get a feel for what your application is doing there's tools like Observer, for example, that give you a more visual representation of that. But in my experience, being able to actually execute code on the application and get some data back allows me to more interactively troubleshoot issues. So I've used that a lot myself. So those are kind of like the major pieces of this. Distillery is a tool that builds on top of releases. Releases are part of OTP. They come from Erlang, and they've been around since very early days of Erlang. I'm not sure I was even able to find in the source code where they were first introduced. But Distillery basically makes releases a little bit more of a first-class citizen with Elixir. So it introduces a mixed task called mixed release, plugin system, which includes like a behavior, allows you to inject overlays into the release to put your own files and scripts and so on in there, and then allows you to maybe tie on to the end of that build process so you can generate an RPM package or a deb package or Docker image or whatever you want based on the release tarball that's generated. So it's extensible in that way. There's also some lifecycle hooks that it injects into those utility scripts I mentioned that allow you to attach to common lifecycle events in a release, like pre and post start, pre and post upgrade, those kind of things. So if you need to do some like custom tweaking of how the release is initialized or the environment around it, those things enable you to do that. When you initialize Distillery within your project, it's just a release.init task that creates a simple config file. This is sort of the basic release definition. All this is saying is like, I'm creating a release called engine, and that might be the same name as your application. By default, when it generates the config, that is the case. This set version just sets the version to use for the release, and I've introduced this like current version thing that just pulls the version of mix.exs for the application that you pass in. And then the applications list here is optional, but in the case of an umbrella project, which I'm pretending this is, it allows you to specify the applications in the umbrella that you want to be part of the release. By default, again, in an umbrella project, it includes all of the applications that are in the umbrella, but you can create multiple release definitions in the release config file and break things up the way you want. And then on top of that, it also introduces the idea of environments where you can customize how the release is generated based on the environment you're targeting, whether that's development, staging, production. In the case here, like I have a special vm.args file, which I want to use in prod, so I'm passing in the path for that, and that'll be overlaid on top of the release. I'm saying I want to include the Erlang runtime system, ERTS, but you could specify a path to an alternate one, and that's how you generally do cross-compilation for release. If you're targeting, say, a Linux box and building the release on OS X, you can pass in a path to a cross-compiled version of ERTS and use that instead. And then another thing that it introduces here, and this can be used in, all these things can be set in both the environment and the release, by the way, but another thing that adds in is a plugin line here, and this is just how you add plugins to a release, is by tagging them in either the environment or the release definition. The combined I call a profile, so a release definition and environment combined form a profile, and on the command line when you're building like mixed release, you can do mixed release -- profile like engine : prod, and it would pull up this environment in this release and then spit out the tarball for that. So that's fundamentally what Distillery does. When you build mixed release, you get some output like this. Tells you what it's doing. There's a verbose mode where it'll spit out a ton of debugging information that's very useful if things go awry. It tells you where it's pulling the runtime and everything from, and then kind of shows you how you can run it right from your machine. And this is all that's really required for deployment. Probably kind of hard to read, I guess, too small, but you copy the tarball to wherever. In this case, I'm just copying it to temp, and then you untar it and just run the foreground task on the bin script that's in there. That's it. Your application's running. There's some pain points around using releases today, and Distillery, for that matter. And part of that comes from the fact that there's currently a split between how Mix runs projects in development and how releases work. One of those things that pretty much everybody that's used releases has run into is configuration. So you get mixed config files They allow you to do basically whatever you want to write code for in those config files. And releases use the Erlang's sys.config file. This is a static configuration file where mix's config is dynamic. The problem there is that if you have a call like system.getinf in your mix config file, that will not work in the sys.config. Distillery has to convert that mix config file to sys.config at build time. So it's not actually pulling the environment variable at runtime, it's grabbing it at compile time, shoving it in the sys.config, and now on your server when you run it, that environment variable is set to something static and not what you want. Part of this problem is also manifested in the documentation, which I mentioned here. And I'm going to get a little bit more into the doc problems. Another one, error messages during boot. There's probably many of you that have used releases where you've seen that really just gross init terminating during do boot thing. I was talking to Francesco, and he described it as the VM puking, and that's basically exactly right. It looks awful. You can't really read it very well. You have to really dig through it. It's awful. Part of that is because we don't have good tools around warning you if you do something wrong, and so you find out at runtime when you boot the release, and it happens so early in the process that there's no way for us to intercept that and really give you good error messages. And that leads to a lot of lost time trying to figure out where things went wrong, what you did wrong. And sometimes it's not even that you did something wrong, it's that you didn't know that you were doing something wrong. And it's not well integrated into the dev workflow. Like I said, there's this split between mix and distillery, and it's not so much distillery, but just the way releases work. You use mix run and IEXS mix, and they don't use releases under the covers. They're interactively loading and executing code when those tasks run, and releases work in a different way. The idea here is that we should be able to solve all these problems by making some fundamental changes the way releases work with Elixir, and that's what I'm working on these days. Up until now, my work on EXRM and Distillery was on my own time, and I was basically winging it, trying to get as much time as possible to dedicate to this, but I didn't really have much. This past fall, Dockyard hired me to start working on deployment stuff in general for Elixir full time. So that's what I'm focused on these days. And by the way, that's super generous of them to do that. And if you get a chance, you should definitely thank Brian from Dockyard for doing that for the community. So the docs issues I was alluding to, these are the major points. They're really poorly organized. If you've looked at them right now, there's no particular ordering. There's some good top-level tasks in there, but basically if you're looking for something, you're going to have to read through every page to find what you're looking for, probably. On the docs where it's like introducing you to releases and Distillery and how to use them and the problems that you might encounter, it's just way too much too fast. It's a fire hose. I assume that you've either done some deployment or read about releases. Like, I didn't do a very good job of easing you into it. And so that's very evident in the documentation today because I wrote a lot of it in a hurry because I wanted to make sure there was something out there, but I didn't have enough time to really write it the way it should have been written. And then, of course, there's just pretty poor guidance on getting started in general and how to do certain things like, I'm deploying to AWS. What's a good way to approach that? Or what's a good architecture for setting up a CI pipeline? Some of those questions are completely left unaddressed, and there's tons of blog posts on doing it a million different ways. And I think I could do a better job, and Elixir could do a better job of really formalizing, hey, here's some good approaches to this. You can deviate, of course, but we're going to try and answer these questions for you so that you don't have to go searching for the answers to these problems. And dealing with things like, how do I do hot upgrades? Or, I tried to do an upgrade and it failed, and I'm not sure why. Those are some things that I mention in the documentation, but I didn't really delve into too well. To give you an idea of the organization problem I was talking about, on the right is the Phoenix pages, kind of like part of them, not all of them. And on the left is the Distillery docs. And you see it's just like a mess. There's no organization there whatsoever. And this is partially because XDoc did not have the grouping feature that's being used in Phoenix now back when I wrote all these docs, and I never got around to making use of those features once they were introduced. So one of the major things I'm going to be doing is fixing that and trying to get something that looks a lot more readable like it does on the right there, and break things up a little bit better so it's easier to find it just by browsing the table of contents. A little bit more like a book, you know? So obviously one of the key points of this is that I need to fix that organization, and that's going to be one of my first tasks here, is getting that done. So hopefully for all of you that are looking at deploying soon and it's your first time working with Distillery or releases, you can expect to get some better docs real soon. In the meantime, you can always reach out to me, and I'll try and help as best I can. Those are, yeah, I'm not going to dig too much into that. It's just organization. Tutorials, like there's a Phoenix guide right now, but there's actually 2 of them in the docs. I don't know if you saw that in the table of contents. Real great. You don't know which walkthrough to use. One of them has the upgrade process in it, and that's why there's 2 of them, but they really should be combined. But not just Phoenix ones, there should be dealing with migrations and so on. And there are some of those docs in there, but again, they're not really intended for beginners. It's like, I'm expecting that you already have built a release and deployed it, and now you're interested in upgrades, and that's not necessarily the case. You might be wanting to use hot upgrades right out the gate, and I think there should be some tutorials around that. This line, clarified by comparison, I didn't really know how to phrase this in a way that fits on a slide, but the idea here is that a lot of you are coming from different languages, Node, Ruby, Python, Go, C#, whatever. I want to have a page in the docs, like front and center, where if you're coming from one of these communities, I basically compare and contrast how deployment works in those communities and how it works in Elixir. And I feel like that's a really good way to get a feel real quick on what the primitives are and how things differ from how you're used to them. And I think you'd find in practice that there's not all that much that's different. It's just a little bit of a shift from how maybe you're doing it today. And depending on the language you're coming from, it might not be that big of a shift at all. But there is no such thing right now. I just kind of dive right into the terminology and expect you to pick it up without any sort of like comparison to use as a reference point. So that's a big one that I'm hoping to do soon as well. And then the principle of just starting simple and then building on that foundation, having more of a flow to the documentation rather than just scattershot, bunch of pages, and good luck finding what you're looking for. That's kind of the documentation side of things. I hope that that makes you feel better if you're interested in using it, if you've been using releases, or if you're looking into using it. If not, please let me know what ideas you think might be helpful to toss into that, because I'm looking at any way to make those better. Beyond documentation, the next big umbrella that really solves the remainder of the problems I identified there on the pain point slide is this idea of integrating releases into Mix itself. And that's part of what I was hired to do at Dockyard, is make releases part of core. So I've been working with the core team on doing that. It's still very early stages on that, but fundamentally the idea is we make the primitives that are part of releases part of the core language tooling, part of Mix. Change the mix run and IEXS mix tasks to actually use releases under the covers, the foreground and the console tasks, effectively. That way, you're always using releases. You don't have like this weird split between not using them and using them. Part of making it part of the core language as well is getting Elixir early enough into the boot process where we can actually use Mix's config structure instead of the sys.config file. The sys.config file would always be supported because it's sort of a fundamental part of how the emulator works, but we could pretty much avoid using it all the time and just focus on using mixed configuration, which would completely remove that weird shift from, oh, everything was working fine in dev, and then I deployed a release and I'm getting weird values from my environment variables or something like that. It would be one config approach, and that would solve a lot of the conversations that I've seen on blog posts on approaching config. We've got several different libraries that approach the problem from different angles. I would like to unify that under this umbrella. And part of that, and this is not confirmed yet because I'm still running some experiments, but effectively introducing an Elixir init. So the way Erlang boots is there's a module very early in the process. The very first piece of Erlang code that's called invokes the init boot function. And all that does is it starts up like the application supervisor, the controller it's called, and it starts all the applications in the release. And when problems occur there, that's where we're getting the really ugly messages from, because not very much is available at that point, so it's very difficult to pretty print data structures and error messages and things like that. By getting ourselves early in that init process and taking over as much of that as possible, I think we can really fix a lot of those really strange issues that you encounter where you're like, I'm not really sure what went wrong here, but I'll go talk to Paul and he'll probably tell me. So I'm really excited about this one. I was actually trying to hack something together here today to show you, and I got it most of the way working, but didn't quite have enough time to finish it. I also mentioned here, like, either an init or an alternative application controller, but after doing some research, I really think that they sort of fall under the same umbrella. Like, there would be some changes that would probably be required in both. And this is going to require some coordination with the OTP team, I'm almost certain. In order to do this, we basically need to have them support the idea of some sort of event callback when things go wrong, which, you know, if we provide a module using like a VMArg or something like that, could then call our code to handle that error however we see fit. A lot of those conversations remain completely open, or I haven't talked to the core team on that. So I'm interested to see where that goes, but that's what's been in my mind. I already talked to Jose about it a little bit, and you know, it is interesting to both of us because it solves a lot of these problems. But getting Elixir in there early in Elixir-based releases, we don't have to have this weird difference where we've got some messages in Erlang data structure format and some in Elixir, and a lot of the very dense, obtuse Erlang errors because they're not pretty printed. It becomes much easier to read and understand what mistakes may have been made. So the initial release of this new tooling is basically going to have simple formal releases. You know, like I said, mix run and IEX as mix. No daemon version of it, because I mean at this point probably not too many people using that anyways with the advent of things like systemd, but nevertheless that's something I would plan to support in the future, but not yet. There wouldn't be support for hot upgrades initially, but would obviously be planned to be supported sometime in the future. But the idea here is to get the framework in place so that we can then build on these tools and bring the rest of these features to the table later. Like I said, finally close the gap on configuration, just kind of fix that, friendly error message, all that good stuff, and then really sort of close that gap between dev and prod that's been present now. And so many people spend a lot of time in dev. When they come to the language, they haven't really deployed to prod yet. And when they finally get there, it's like everything that they learned it's not quite that extreme, but it feels like the way you were doing things was suddenly wrong somehow. And it's not that it was wrong, it's just that there's this weird gap that we haven't been able to close so far. And we're planning to target Elixir 1.7 for this, but that may change. Nothing's set in stone until Jose tags the thing, so we'll see how it goes. But that's kind of the gist of this. As far as what will happen to Distillery in the future after this, the plan is to basically extend the core tooling and provide things that it cannot, or the core team is not willing to maintain. And it may be the case that we can get rid of Distillery entirely, which would be awesome for me because I could work on other stuff. But for now, it will still be the go-to tool to use, at least until this initial version is released. My hope is that this fall I can point you all to the core tools and be like, see ya, we got other stuff to do. There's a few other issues that remain unsolved from my perspective. One is cross-compilation. For those of you who either have not deployed yet or have not deployed with NIFs involved in your project, natively implemented functions, when you build your release, you have to target the production system, right? And that goes for all the C modules that are part of the project. They have to be cross-compiled for that target. If you're building on, say, a Linux box, an Ubuntu box, and you're deploying to an Ubuntu box, it probably works fine. But if you're building on like OS X and deploying to an Alpine Docker container, that's not going to play well unless you have a cross-compilation toolchain set up. That is non-trivial for the most part, not easy to solve generally. There are some approaches, though. For example, like Nerves does cross-compilation using the build root stuff, the toolchains. I don't have a great idea of the nitty-gritty details that it's doing internally, but I don't think it's a good fit for the core tools, both because the toolchains themselves are quite heavy and require significant initialization, but it just doesn't feel like the right approach for Elixir applications in general. It's the right approach for Nerves, but I don't necessarily think it's the right approach for these tools that are part of core. But there's also the question of education, right? So if you come from a background where you were used to doing cross-compilation or targeting different systems, a lot of this is going to seem like easy. It's not going to be a big deal. You're used to it. And the documentation really should be trying to familiarize yourself with how to approach this. So if I am deploying on my laptop to a Linux box, I shouldn't have to have a build server in the mix, but maybe making use of Docker or Vagrant or some tooling that can be already installed locally on your machine, or maybe is easy to install and allows you to kind of close the gap there. So if you're doing local development, you don't have to have all this other infrastructure in place. I think the docs could do a really good tutorial on that covers that. And there may be approaches that I'm not familiar yet. I know Jose suggested to me, and I spent a lot of time researching this idea of deferring the compilation until runtime. So leaving the NIFs uncompiled, and then when you run your release the first time, it actually uses build tools on the production server to build the NIFs. And I didn't like that idea at all. But I spent time exploring it because the idea was to ease deployment, right? And if this was truly a really big pain point, then maybe it would be worth it. I found it was way too fragile and didn't really work well and was sort of against my ethos around deploying anyways, so I bailed on that. But I'm open to other suggestions. There are some fundamental constraints, and I'm willing to fill anybody's ears on that, but just want you to know that I have had my eye on that, so if that's been a problem that you've had, know that I do care about it. It's just I'm not sure that there is an easy solution for this. I don't think with Erlang we'll ever get to the point where we have Go's level of cross-compilation ease. And that's just because fundamentally Go is both designed around being able to be easy in that sense, and it is completely different runtime, and it's just, we can't get there. But I see a lot of people comparing the way deployment works in Erlang to Go, and I do it myself. And I would love for it to be like Go, but it won't. But we can get pretty close, I think, in covering the documentation and making it clear what things you need to do so that it's not a tripping point for you. It just might be a little extra setup the first time. Lastly, I think dealing with app ups, for people doing hot upgrades, downgrades, app ups are the files that describe how to move from one version of release to another and back. The problem is that the automatically generated app ups that Distillery makes for you right now do a pretty good job, but the thing that they don't handle is when, say you have a gen server that uses a struct for its internal state, if that struct changes or you rename it or fields are renamed or something like that, when you switch from one version to another, the new version of the code is going to be expecting that different struct, but it's going to get a version of the struct that's different. And your code will blow up and the process will crash. So the idea is that you need to know that this is a problem. And right now, the app up generator does not warn you or do any sort of detection when those changes are there. And I think we can get there using some static analysis. It would never be perfect. It can't detect everything. But I think it could definitely detect that case with structs or records. And so I think that would be an interesting problem to approach as well. It's not a target for the near future, but if there's anybody interested in working on this stuff, you know, I'm like the only one doing it, so feel free to get involved. So that's basically it. I know it's fairly quick, but I want to make time for some questions since I'm sure there's a number of them.
Yeah. First of all, just appreciate all the work you're doing. Unbelievable. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
One of the things about Erlang historically is that it does monolithic deploys, right? So I mean, it's like, here's this hunk of hardware, throw some code at it.
Yeah.
Are you giving any thought to how to do a more component-based, like almost like, I'm not going to use the word services because I get shouted at, but that kind of, multiple components being deployed pseudo-independently?
Like releases that are, like you have a single release, but deploying it to multiple nodes where some applications are started on some nodes and not others?
Yeah, and then maybe I can hot swap individual components on a node or a set of nodes or whatever else.
I haven't thought about hot swapping a specific component because the way hot upgrades work, it's really sort of a whole system thing, particularly if like between versions, the runtime version changes. However, the way code upgrades work is it's not going to touch things that weren't actually changed. So you could deploy an app up that is only going to touch one component in the system. There is facilities for running applications on different nodes under a given release. However, I do think it might make more sense to do multiple releases rather than using that particular module, that tool, to distribute applications across different nodes. However, there's the edge case too where you may want one node to be responsible for an application in a cluster where they're all running the same release. In that case, you really need to use that tooling. So I do think it needs documentation. Right now, the only documentation for that is in the Erlang docs, and it's not easy to find. It's buried enough where I only on the surface know how that works right now. It's like a kernel config. But I do think that that is something that is worth investigating some more. I know you were working on more of a component-based approach to this. So it would be interesting to get an idea of what impact that has on how releases are configured and built to see if there's some changes that need to be made there. And I'm looking for that feedback from people like yourself as well to tell me what the weak points are, the difficulties that you have in deploying in a given way. Because I think Jose shares my belief in this, that releases and the tooling that's going to be part of core needs to be extremely flexible and extensible. And so it can't do a lot, but it needs to do the basic things really right and make sure that you have what you need to be able to customize it the way that you need to for your particular use case. Hopefully that answered your question. I wandered a little bit. But.
Just thank you for pushing back against running compilers and
I want to be fair to Jose. It's not that he wanted to do that. It's just that he wanted to make sure that we investigated every option, and that was the only alternative that we had at the time to going the NERVs toolchains route. I think he would definitely agree that running build tools of any kind on your production boxes is a bad idea. So I am glad that for sure that it didn't work out. But I had to give it a good go anyways, just to make sure that I was being devil's advocate for that use case as well. Any other questions?
First of all, thank you as well for your work, and more specifically, I'm sure you don't remember this, but you really helped me on a Reddit thread get our deploys working for the first time, and thank you specifically for that.
No problem.
Hopefully this is going to be a softball question, but if we already have a working EXRM-based deploy process, is it worth it to switch to Distillery? When should we do that, and what should we expect when we do?
It should be a very easy transition. Are you using hot upgrades? You are? Okay. It still will be pretty trivial. There's not really changes to the release structure itself. The thing that does change is the scripts, and If you ping me when you're making the transition, I can validate to make sure that when you switch versions, do the hot upgrade between the old EXRM release and the Distillery release, that the shell scripts will work together right. You know, I don't know if you've dug into it at all, but it basically, there's a shim script that figures out which version of the release is running, and then calls the releases version of the actual boot script, that shell script, and it does a bunch of stuff. And that part of the infrastructure changed between EXRM and Distillery. I don't think it would be a problem, but it's worth double checking before you go down that path. However, Distillery and EXRM are still very similar under the covers. What is really different is how you define the release and how you configure it. And that part is really easy to transition. Maybe, I guess it was about a year ago now, I did that upgrade for somebody from EXRM to Distillery, and it went super fast. The hardest problem we had was with conform at the time, because that's another library that I wrote to do some like ops style configuration for releases. Well, I can tell you this much, it was pretty painless. There were some things I had to change, but not much at all. It was mostly testing to make sure that it worked the way I thought it did doing the upgrade. But I'm more than willing to work through it with you, because I think at this point EXRM is old enough and it's been deprecated for long enough where you really want the fixes that have been integrated into Distillery, and it's just much easier to work with at this point. I'm sure at some point with deprecations, EXRM will just stop working with the latest version of Elixir. It already is? Well, that figures. Yeah, I would be more than willing to help you make that transition. It's pretty easy.
Question here. When deploying mostly stateless web applications, you usually deploy them to multiple nodes.
Yeah.
And usually you use some kind of load balancer with maybe connection draining. So is there ever a reason to use hot upgrades in that case?
I will say that it depends. I would say in general, hot upgrades is not something that you need. You might make the argument that it is, but I'm not sure that it really is. It's there because, you know, originally Erlang was designed for telecom, so they needed to be in an environment where there was zero downtime, and the whole system could be carefully upgraded from one version to the next without affecting anything. If your system is truly like that, then yes, hot upgrades are definitely worth using, and you could even use it in combination with connection drain to make things even safer. But you probably wouldn't need connection drain with hot upgrades. But there's nevertheless, you need to coordinate hot upgrade deployments across a cluster in order to make sure that it happens the way you want. If you're doing one node at a time, you're going to have some problems there.
Any more questions? This will be the last question.
You guys can definitely walk up and ask me questions later too. You don't have to force them all in now.
Well, I want to echo the thanks and even personal time that you helped me also. You know,
no
you're
problem.
a great asset to the community.
Thanks.
You mentioned management scripts, and you know we've been, you know, I think there's a layer on top of what Distillery offers that eDeliver and you know, the bootleg guys I met today kind of offer that. Do you see, where do you see that boundary and that coordination moving forward with your new vision of where this is going?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things I want to get away from is the amount of shell that's currently in Distillery itself. There's a considerable amount that's delegated to shell. And moving as much of that out of shell and into like Elixir scripts or something is something that Jose and I both agree on as a goal. I don't know how much of it really can practically be moved out of it, because a lot of the code that's in there now is like setting up the path to something, setting up the code paths. And a lot of that's really sort of native to how shell works. It's great for that stuff, but it's really difficult to maintain. However, as far as boundaries go, particularly with something like eDeliver, my hope would be that we get away from using shell and move more stuff into Elixir, because it's easier for Elixir programmers to stay in a single context, right? If you're comfortable in Elixir but not comfortable in shell, it's way easier to do the orchestration stuff that you need to do inside Elixir. A lot of the tasks you need to do, say pre-upgrade or pre-start, like running migrations, for example, you shouldn't need to write a shell script to run the migrations. It should be possible to specify a callback that then calls some function in your application to do those migrations. Right now, that's not, I kind of papered over it with the hooks that are in Distillery now. And it's really easy to set up a simple hook to do migrations, but there were problems with that where some people had it working and some didn't, and then there were some code changes in between versions of Elixir where the function I was using in the docs broke. I want to get away from that kind of stuff where it's very fragile. And my experience with eDeliver, and I haven't used it myself, but just working through problems with people, has been that because eDeliver is built primarily on shell, it's extremely fragile, and it does a lot. I think moving away from that approach to something that's a little bit more native to Elixir tools would be nice. A bootleg is an example of a tool that I saw that's primarily Elixir. I think it does some shell maybe under the covers, but keeps you in that same context for doing deployment. So I'd like to remove the boundaries as much as possible, but have a clear demarcation between these are the foundational building blocks of how you do or how you build deployment artifacts, and then the tools that are building on top of that just leverage those things. And the community has kind of already done that on its own. eDeliver builds on both Distillery, Relics, and it even did it on top of EXRM, supported all three of them at the same time. So getting to that point where all the tools kind of are working together rather than doing their own thing in different ways is important to this process, I think. Cool. Well, thanks so much.
Exciting times ahead for deployment. No pressure.